Welcome to Oh God, What Now? I'm Dorian Lynskey. On today's show, Starmer's Labour has unveiled its first programme for government in the King's Speech. What policies are in it, what's missing, and what does it tell us about Labour's ambitions? Plus, why are so many election candidates facing intimidation and abuse, and what could be done to make the job safer? And in the extra bit for supporters, if you really absolutely gun to the head had to, how would you save the Conservative Party after its worst ever defeat? We'll offer some helpful suggestions. Let's meet today's panel. First, journalist Hannah Fearn. Hi, Hannah.
Hello.
So Tuesday was a day for resigning. Gareth Southgate quit as England manager after losing the title of centrist dad-in-chief to Keir Starmer. France's Prime Minister Gabriel Attal resigned along with his entire government because of that whole mess. And Vaughan Gething is getting a new job. Europe's first black national leader stepped down as First Minister of Wales after 4 scandal-plagued months in the role. Hannah, why did he have to go? Was he the author of his own misfortune? Is there any other way this could have worked out?
Yes, he was. So he lost a vote of no confidence in his leadership about a month ago, which was over 2 things: his handling of sacking a minister, and also, more importantly, a bigger row over some donations he'd had to his leadership campaign, which obviously wasn't that long ago. It was only 4 months ago.
Big donations.
Really big donations, and from a business figure who it was found to have broken lots of environmental rules with his business and had been, in trouble with the law for that. He powered on at this point. He said, I've been chosen for leadership. I broke no rules, very reminiscent of Boris, obviously, in the similar kind of fall of his leadership. But then this row, basically, and the vote of no confidence ended up breaking his working relationship with Plaid Cymru in the Welsh Parliament,
right,
which basically meant he'd lost his ability to govern and to get things done. Then what really sparked this situation this week is that 4 of his ministers quit, so that was the end of him. He stepped down, but really with no grace whatsoever. And so I think the most interesting thing is that he essentially quit to save Welsh Labour, but was so petulant in doing so that he probably has not saved them. There's a big election coming up in 2026. They're not doing well in the same way that, the National Labour Party is.
So obviously Welsh Labour has some autonomy, but, Starmer's prioritised cleaning up politics.
Yeah.
So is any scandal a death sentence for a Labour politician?
I think so. Ironically, Starmer said that he was doing a good job not that long ago and really backed him during his own campaign. So,
but was that because during the election campaign, you just want to... The fact that he stepped down not long after the election made me think the idea was, let's not have a big resignation now.
Yeah, his ministers didn't quit until after the election was over. They didn't want to create a Labour crisis. But yeah, I think, we heard we'll talk much more about the King's Speech, but we heard Starmer talk about the need for a duty of candour. He's legislating for that for public office. So I think anyone who makes any kind of misstep under Starmer is going to be out.
And joining us is Associate Political Editor for the New Statesman, Rachel Cunliffe. Hello, Rachel.
Hello.
Donald Trump has picked his running mate at the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee. It's J.D. Vance, best-selling author of Hillbilly Elegy, junior senator from Ohio, and Trump critic turned MAGA sycophant. Now, normally when you're choosing a Veep, you balance the ticket, but he is also a white man. He's not from a battleground state, and they both hate women. What does he have going for him?
Well, I think you answered your own question there by saying he's a never-Trumper turned Trump sycophant. And I think that is one of the key reasons behind this pick in that Trump has gone for somebody not just who supports him, but who has done a 180 on supporting him and kind of, if we want to be honest, has really humiliated themselves in the eyes of many who are not Trumpers in the sheer, I said this one thing and now I'm saying the opposite. And what that tells us is that Trump wants loyalty above everything else. I also think J.D. Vance is someone who, unlike Mike Pence, didn't really have, he's young, he's 39, didn't really have much of a political career beforehand. So it's not like he has sort of his own legacy to fall back on. He's very much hitched himself to Trump's coattails. And then the third thing it tells you is that Trump is doubling down on Trumpism. J.D. Vance, obviously from Ohio, not a battleground state, but one of those Rust Belt, left behind parts of America that Trump's base really has grown out of. And it's not about widening the base. It's not about reaching out to ethnic minorities, might have picked Marco Rubio, to women, might have picked Nikki Haley, who ran against him. It's or kind of centrist establishment politicians. It's about more Trump, even more Trumpism, and somebody who's just going to say yes to whatever it is.
I wonder whether, the whole J.D. Vance experience that the media has gone through is maybe going to sort of like kill the myth of the good conservative, because there was so much excitement over Hillbilly Elegy. And he was like, oh, he's criticising Trump, he's showing empathy for the poor, which actually the book does not. It mainly shows contempt. But there was a huge amount of enthusiasm about him, like he was this reasonable guy. And this has happened before. And I just wonder whether you have to stop getting excited and go, well, this conservative is different. He's not MAGA. And it's like, fast forward 2 years. Oh, he is.
Well, there is an interview with him from a couple of months ago in the New Statesman that people can go and read and find out what is behind the J.D. Vance ideology. I read Hillbilly Elegy when it first came out, and I thought it was really good at articulating what has gone wrong for a significant portion of Left Behind America. And I thought that the rawness and the honesty with which he talked about the community he grew up in and the problems facing people there, particularly addiction, alcoholism, unemployment, because the opportunities are just not there. He did manage to articulate those in a very powerful way. What I found quite odd about it is you get to the end of the book, and one, he doesn't mention Black people once, and many of those issues are equally a factor in America's ethnic minority communities. It's like whites do not have a monopoly on issues with lack of employment opportunities and addiction and mental health and all of that. And two, there weren't really any solutions there. It was just like, we're left behind and things are bad. And you'd have thought maybe with a book like that, he would have drawn from his own experience and said, this is what helped me. Maybe it can help other people. And there's no kind of, here's what I learned and how I could help other people message in that book. It's not a political manifesto.
There's a very good podcast in the If Books Could Kill series where they go into Hillbilly Elegy. They do not like it, but it's very illuminating. And we should also mention that failed Prime Ministers Liz Truss and Boris Johnson were in Milwaukee, with Johnson claiming that support for Ukraine would be safe under Trump, despite Vance in particular making it very clear that it would not be, and he couldn't care what happened to a single Ukrainian. Why is Johnson saying this?
So I think Boris Johnson has this belief that if he just says it, then that will help encourage Trump. I've spoken to him. He's a good guy. He gets things, to sort of play on Trump's ego, which is something that other political leaders have tried at various points. So I think that's what's behind it. I think it's also about getting him attention and coverage. That's obviously why Liz Truss was there. She's not an MP anymore, but she was there posing in this bright red dress going, make America great again, and all that. And it's kind of against some of the stuff that she's talked about as well. She's also talked about Ukraine and, the importance of being tough on China and Taiwan. So all of their principles just seem to go out the window. Possibly money, let's be clear.
I just think that the message, unfortunately, I hate to be, display lefty bias here, but one sees again and again that conservatives are not chained by principle, it seems, particularly when they come into contact with Donald Trump. Let's begin. King Prince Charles gave his first speech of the Starmer era just before we recorded. He announced a whole raft of new bills and policies, most of which had been heavily trailed, because this is the no surprises government. I'm going to ask both of you first, before we get into the policies. Hannah, what was your top line? There's about 40 policies here. What did a narrative spring out? Did a message, a vibe come out of this?
I think the vibe for me is one that we've heard from Starmer a lot since he became Prime Minister, and actually before that, which is this is about service. And he talked about service over being self-interested. And it's, I want to say, not quite boring. Obviously, Hannah's laughing because it can kind of feel boring because we heard a lot of the stuff before, but it really is about getting the fundamentals right and creating a country where the environment to work and do well and be able to support yourself and to not have to worry too much about politics because the country just works, that's what the big sell is. That's what the message is, what the vibe is. And I think a number of bills were kind of in that we're just going to fix this thing so that part of your life that doesn't work, it will, and then you don't have to think about it.
I'm laughing partly because he manages to make really exciting things boring.
Yeah,
so
he does.
There's Starmer and Reeves have together written this speech for the King to deliver, and there's actually lots to be really excited about in it, and we're going to get into all of it. But for me, what really made me happy was to hear that right at the top of the speech is that he's talking about, as well as stability, economic stability and security and all of those things, he also mentions fairness right in the sort of opening sentence. And it does go on to give a very, very balanced view of the legislative agenda that's forthcoming that really does balance kind of that kind of hard economic infrastructure investment side with stuff that, you know, the right-wing press will consider touchy-feely nonsense, but really does embed fairness in the country, things that actually can't be easily undone. And it's really exciting, but you're right, somehow it manages to come across, when delivered, in a stoic, solid, quiet, kind of serious way by King Charles.
I think this is actually, it's a deliberate choice. Now, I don't think it's the only choice that he could make. But I thought it was really interesting that he talked about the snake oil of populism. And I think it's this idea that some people say that the way you fight right-wing populism is with left-wing populism and something that's just as exciting and something more along the Corbyn lines. And Starmer's approach is actually like, no, the people who are trying to get you excited are lying to you. They're trying to go, this is going to be easy. We're going to make these big dramatic changes and everything's going to be great. And this is bullshit. And the reality is like hard work, which I think is like a really, really, it's like a really interesting pitch. Now, people can disagree with that and go, well, no, you know, the left should have its own sort of excitement. But I like the way it partly, you know, his temperament and partly sort of strategy is it's just like, we are against easy options and we are against this kind of like soaring rhetoric, whether that be Corbyn's or Johnson, well, not Corbyn's sword, but you know what I mean, or Johnson's.
Yeah, against sound bites,
against sound bites.
Anti-media
and
delivery.
again and again, he's just like, he's totally against that. And so when people call him boring, you kind of think his answer is like, yes. Yeah. Like, you're getting it.
Yeah, I do admire that as well, actually.
Yeah.
But I'm laughing because it is actually quite a skill when you are entrenched in that world to make something sound dull when actually it's really exciting.
Well, let's talk about what's exciting. Hannah, everyone wants to build houses. Like all the parties that they wanted to build houses.
Apart from the Greens.
Did they not want to build any houses?
Well, and the Lib Dems.
No. They did say they were. Well, let me finish. But the question is where?
But
everyone wants to build houses in principle.
But not here.
So what is Labour hoping to do to planning laws? We should say, of course, obviously this is all what they want to do. With this majority, one imagines that it will happen. But of course, it's not happening yet.
This planning legislation overhaul is really important because it basically abolishes NIMBYism. You can't get away with it anymore.
Fist pump.
It's not it's not a where are we going to build these houses, it's how are we going to do them, not if. There's no discussion. It's like, we're getting it done, so you help us work out how we're going to get these numbers on the ground. Your input is not yes or no anymore. And that, I really like that. And I think it's really important and kind of under-discussed that it just removes that level of frustration for, yes, housing, but not just housing, infrastructure as well, which is really important. If you think about the failure of HS2 and the years that took and how it had to be abandoned in the end, that is because of failure of planning as well as political ambition.
Well, like with the housing, it's partly that the thing is just like, look, the bits of the Greenbelt are shit.
Yeah.
And we're basically going to rebrand them because it includes like abandoned service stations and stuff, doesn't it?
Yeah, there was a headline in a newspaper, and I can't remember which one, so I won't name it, that was like, you know, where are they coming for the Greenbelt? You know, if you live near a golf course or a disused car park.
It was the Daily Mail.
It was the Daily Mail.
Yeah. It was like a NIMBY manifesto.
And it was like, if I lived next to a disused car park, I would much rather that they built a block of flats on there and you got some council tax from it. And
we had houses built at the end of our back garden. And
did you object to them, Dorian?
And no, I didn't. And of course, it was kind of annoying, like having building work. And we got it sort of blocked out, you know, some light and and all that lot. But before then, it was full of like rusting cars and weeds, and there was just no rational objection that one could make. It's like, should people live here, or should we
continue festering rusting cars,
festering wrecks? And it was like, well, of course, those bits. Sorry, Hannah.
No, that's fine. So I think it's very exciting. There's compulsory purchase legislation as well, which is going to make it easier and cheaper to buy up bits of land that frustrate housing being developed, and that's really important for social housing, because often it is those little pockets as you described where there's a load of kind of random bins or some rusting cars just sitting in between two houses, and they're the easiest social housing, cheapest social housing to build is in those slots. So fingers crossed, everyone, that this is it, that we're going to see.
Because its house building ambitions, as far as I can say, depend on changing the planning laws, and then private developers will come in because it's good business. Can we get enough homes, and certainly the right kind of homes, like social housing, without the state building them? Because of course, back in the day, loads of council houses were built by the state. By councils, hence.
By definition.
By definition. Can we get enough just by hoping that private developers will rush in?
I think the coverage of this has been kind of unfair to the new government so far. It depends what you mean by private developers. When someone hears that on the TV or the radio, they think of, the big names like Barratt or whoever that come in and build large estates simply for private sale. Actually, private developers work with housing associations all the time to build social housing.
Right.
So I think too much has been read into the term private developers. It essentially means councils can't afford to build right now and they're not in a state to do so. And that is true. There is really very little capacity for council housing right now. Even if you inject loads of cash, they're just not in a position to be able to do it. So it is going to require private developers. It doesn't necessarily mean there's not going to be enough social housing. I am very hopeful that there will be, but we do need to hear some numbers pretty soon, I think, to stop people asking those questions incessantly and believing that they're being shafted.
And just quickly, what's happening to renters?
Well, so we've also got the rented reform bill, which the Tories tried to push through and failed to do so because all their own people were landlords and didn't want to put it through. So that should go through. That's an end to no-fault evictions, greater securities on a whole range of issues if you're private renting. It also means there should be a decent home standard, and Awab's law, which is the kind of quality and repair, which is for the social housing sector, is also going to be extended to private rent as well. So there should be some decent standards of housing as a basic for private renters.
And one thing that's in there that I'm quite excited about, this wasn't in the King's speech itself, but it was in the accompanying document that journalists got sent, is a right, if you're a tenant, to request a pet.
Yes.
And that landlords...
Well, they have to give you a pet.
Well, the landlords will have to provide. Yes, you can choose a cat or a dog, and those are the only two available. No, it's that landlords won't be able to unreasonably ban you from having a pet. And how this is going to work in practice is interesting. There will be like insurance that landlords can get you to take out, so that if the pet ruins things. But I remember. Campaigning on this a couple of years ago with a Conservative MP actually, but sort of pointing out that most landlords in the private rental sector will just say no, and that makes it really difficult for people who have pets, and pets are really important for well-being and mental health and nice things.
Incidentally, leaseholders have also, at least those who own the leasehold, I should say, leasehold owners rather than the actual people living in the properties, have also denied people pets in their own homes.
But I was in a leasehold property for 9 years, and the rule stated that if I wanted to get a cat, the people I bought the flat from had cats, but if I wanted to get a cat, I needed to request permission, and I had to pay for like a pet form to allow me to have it.
Well, key things on a personal note, my daughter recently got stiffed thanks to a 0 hours contract. She was raging about them. She was just like, I'm going to do everything I can to abolish 0 hours contracts. Now, Labour plans to, is it ban them entirely or ban like unreasonable ones?
So the details of Labour's ban on 0 hours contract came out a couple of months ago, and there have sort of been close negotiations with the unions and also with business groups on this. They're going to ban unreasonable 0 hours contracts essentially, and say that everyone has the right to a contract that reflects the amount of work that they normally do for that organisation, and also that you have the right to request a non-zero hours contract or sort of the right to negotiate from the get-go, which some people are saying doesn't go far enough, because if you're in a market where, you want a job and the company is like, you're okay with this 0 hours contract, right? You're okay with it, right? Because if you're not okay with it, like we might give it to someone else, then that's not really fixing the problem. If we're in a situation which we are now with a very tight labour market where actually workers have a slight advantage, it does give them the negotiating tools to try and get a better deal. I'm not sure if it would have helped your daughter in that particular example, but certainly the plan is that this is not anti-business. This is actually good for economic growth, because people are able to be more productive and to plan better, and it benefits the economy and it benefits everyone if workers know what hours they're working and if companies treat them properly.
One of the things that it does really help with is that people can't use 0 hours contracts to basically get rid of staff without paying some kind of redundancy. As you say, it's reflecting this idea that if you're normally working 33 hours a week or something, you can't suddenly have zero work for the next 6 weeks and still be considered
just incredibly unjust. So briefly, Rachel, are the unions happy at the moment?
I think there is an understanding that the New Deal for working people as a whole is really radical. As Hannah said at the start, like, it is a way of some quite radical policies dressed up to sound quite boring. And there's other stuff there, like the right to sick pay and other worker protections from day one, making it illegal to fire a woman who's just had a baby sort of 6 months after she returns to work. And there are, again, that's another thing where the idea is that that's holding people back at the moment, because if you know that if you switch jobs, you're going to lose all your worker protection, you're not going to switch to a job that's better paid, perhaps better in terms of productivity. So I think the unions are pleased that it is happening, and this is one of the things that Labour is prioritising. First 100 days, big policy, sort of co-led on by Johnny Reynolds, the business secretary, and Angela Rayner. Could it have gone further? Yes. Is this still pretty radical, and are there going to be some businesses that are really quite pissed off about it? Also, yes.
Yeah, no, I had Bridget Phillipson on World at One, and she kept being asked, well, why isn't this in here? And I was there, and she's just going, it's the first speech. This is our first year. So we are going to do other things. That was sort of like her set answer, which seemed evasive, but also seemed entirely true. So, Hannah, more things that should be exciting for the left. Publicly owned GB Energy and rail nationalisation are on the agenda.
Yeah. They are quite different.
They work. Oh, yes, because one is not nationalising all the energy companies, is it?
Sadly, no. No, GB Railways, or Great British Railways, however you want to call it, is essentially, it's a slow process. So it's going to create this overseeing body which will be managing the whole system as kind of one entity, even while it's still in different ownership. And then slowly, as the train operating company contracts expire, they will be brought under its control. Obviously, some might come even quicker if they fail to deliver on their objectives, as we know that's why some are already, as they already have, so some are already in public ownership. And this is obviously really good, because up until now we've had a situation where under privatisation, things like timetabling is all done independently by each company. So we've got a country where you can't easily travel from the north right down to the south coast on connecting trains, because all the companies that operate the different trains have no obligation to connect with each other. And so it's been chaos. So these kind of things will happen more quickly, those kind of timetabling issues and so on. But the actual whole system being kind of one entity is going to take a long time. And also it won't include things like the rolling stock. The actual trains won't belong to the state. So it's not quite British Rail again.
No, it's not back to where we were.
But for some might say that's a good thing, actually, that this might work better than that ever did. GB Energy is a very different thing. It's a publicly owned energy company, which is designed to help the UK meet its ultimate goal of being based on clean power by 2030, which, let's be honest, isn't that long away. When you say 2030, I don't know, feels like a distant age, but it's 6 years away. So, but it is mainly an investment vehicle. So it's 8 billion a capitalisation project to bring in finance for all kinds of things. So offshore floating wind, nuclear energy, some really fancy stuff around hydrogen, real life breaking technology stuff. And it will be brilliant for growth. It will be really good for our setting us up as a kind of eco economy, as it were. But it isn't going to have any direct control over providing your energy to your home, and it's definitely not going to control your bills. So
Sure.
People will be possibly a bit disappointed that they might not see anything tangible in the same way that they will actually see something tangible from Great British Rail.
Rachel, some of the things we talked about so far, like there isn't the money to build the houses and there isn't the money to, renationalise, industries. So all the biggest doubts about Labour throughout the campaign concerned money and how they're going to fix all these things without, bring up taxes. Is the VAT on private schools the only thing in the speech which involves bringing in more revenue? Or is there something I've missed there?
So the plan is that we're going to have a budget in autumn, and Rachel Reeves wants the OBR to do a proper analysis and forecast of all that. And a lot of the tax and spend decisions have sort of been kicked down the road until after that point.
Yeah.
And I think it is likely that we'll see some things, particularly on capital gains tax, in the budget after that point. That's certainly what people are expecting. The other thing that is in the King's Speech is the National Wealth Fund, which is over £7 billion being invested in this essentially a sovereign wealth fund, with the hope that the state puts in some capital and sets the regulatory and political agenda, really, and encourages a whole lot of private investment in that. And Mark Carney is helping to lead on that, and various other key figures in the finance world. So a lot of it is about we, the government, promise that if you're thinking about somewhere to invest your money, we can be pretty certain that the terms will be the same in 5 years' time, so you can make those long-term decisions, so you can invest. So again, it's about using private capital, but it's about using the state to create the environment where private capital goes, oh, actually, maybe I will invest in this, as opposed to running off someone that's a bit more stable because you guys can't work out who your prime minister is.
And I've noticed that the advocates for trans rights kind of were kind of disappointed and then pleased by different things. Having been very disappointed about Wes Streeting extending the Tory ban on puberty blockers, they, obviously welcomed the kind of across-the-board ban on conversion therapy. Yeah. Now, what I wondered here was whether this was also part of the no culture wars message that they are all pushing. That the definition of a culture war, right, is that everything falls on one side or another. Yeah. So on that issue, for example, you're kind of you're either sort of, pro trans rights in all of these different senses or anti. And I wondered whether I don't think it's a contradiction at all, because I think we're talking about two entirely different things here, really. But I wondered whether that was part of it.
Yeah,
part of the sort of subliminal message was actually we're going to decide policy by policy, and you might disagree with this or that decision, but what it's not about is an ideological camp. Yes,
I think that's definitely true. And the thread on Twitter that Wes Streeting did when he made the announcement about puberty blockers, which he knew would be controversial and upset some people quite considerably, was actually very careful in talking about what made that different from conversion therapy and various other things, in his view, around the kind of the medical evidence and so on. And he also was very clear about how engaged the government is with the various research programs that are going on around the long-term effects on puberty blockers. So he wasn't being clear that this wasn't a ban on it forever, potentially. It was almost a pause, in fact. So that's quite interesting. I think there's more to it as well. I think it's about the kind of what is their cross-house support for, that they can unify politics a little bit and try and calm everything down. So the smoking ban an age-by-age basis is in there. That is something that the Conservatives proposed, Labour supported, and they're continuing that. So, there were elements of your legislative agenda that we agreed with.
I still think it's slightly mad. It's quite funny considering it's probably got the most support in the Commons of any policy.
It is a bit strange, as rather than just bringing in a hard ban on a particular day. But there we go. I guess it's harder to strip someone of their existing rights than to change. But that's got cross-government support, as has the banning on ads on junk foods and so on. But then when you look at things like mental health, for me, that was the kind of rabbit in the hat, where they've got all of these issues that there is some kind of cross-house support for, and then you throw in something that nobody was expecting, which was the reform of the Mental Health Act, very, very long overdue, a complex piece of legislation, will require really hard work and not something that the Conservatives have touched. And so to wrap that up in the same section of the speech, I thought was quite interesting. As you say, it's a little bit of like, we are listening, and we're listening to you and all of the things that matter, rather than just taking a ideological line and slamming our hands down on the table.
Well, the phrase that keeps occurring to me is like the sort of the relative to the Tories was the absence of malice, and that they can come to conclusions that different people can, may agree or disagree with. But what I don't sense is something that is sort of like a vengeful, persecuting spirit, which I did get from obviously various Tory ministers, rather than being an obvious one. There seemed to be an active malice, and all the language that they're presenting, and I've noticed this across the board, is pretty much just like, we do not want to do this. We do not want to do the warring stuff. And some people have every right to go, well, I think this policy is malicious. I think not lifting the, two-child benefit cap, causes suffering or whatever. But one does not see that vindictive gleam that one saw from many Tories.
If it doesn't feel to me like we stand against you in some way, it's removing opposition and talking about collaboration, for sure.
Rachel, exciting constitutional change in the House of Lords. Hereditary peers will lose the right to sit and vote, but the manifesto policy of retirement at 80 was not in the speech. Like, what's going on is there much resistance to Lords reform, I should say?
Well, Lords reform is a really interesting one, because I think everyone agrees that if you were going to design a constitutional system that has an upper house, you would not design it as a bunch of hereditary peers, a couple of bishops, and then mainly like political appointees that both parties try and get the numbers up, that with unlimited numbers.
And the biggest upper house in the world, or the
other
second
than
biggest,
China,
or something?
yeah. And it doesn't really make sense. But people also recognise that the House of Lords, for all its many, many faults, does work quite well, particularly at sense-checking legislation. And the wealth of experience that you have there is actually quite useful. I mean, if you've ever been to a House of Lords debate, they are so much more interesting than the Commons one. I would actually urge anyone, you can just turn up and go and watch debates, and they're really quite interesting. Hereditary peers is kind of the first step. Labour originally talked about abolishing it and replacing it with something else. What is unclear. Hereditary peers, nobody really thinks that people should have a say in our legislative process just because of who their parents were. And the retirement age was sort of supposedly about making space for a new generation, because there were just too many people who are there. Quite a lot of pushback because of the experience of some of the peers who are of that age. Pushback as well because of the sort of ageism element of it. I mean, the President of the United States wouldn't be eligible to sit in the House of Lords under that. But I think also an awareness that Labour are going to have to, for they might want to get rid of the House of Lords eventually, to get their legislation through, they're going to have to put a whole lot of people in the House of Lords, and maybe having like multiple battles on that at the same time is just too much.
Hereditary peers were the original Nepo babies, weren't they?
Yeah.
Centuries ago. So quickly, Hannah, there's so many policies. Is there anything missing that you think is really important?
Missing, people have talked about the two-child benefit. It was never going to be in there, so I wasn't expecting it. But some form of welfare reform in general was missing, I think. But the flip side is I was very delighted to hear that there's an industrial strategy on the way. It's one of the big criticisms I had of the Conservative era, the whole last 10 years, was that it was the prime block on social mobility, that there was no strategy for where new roles were going to come from. You couldn't prime schools and educators to help people up through the social mobility ladder by directing them towards kind of employment that was creating opportunity. So let's hope that's coming now.
Rachel, what slightly annoyed me listening to, I think, Phillipson being interviewed was this sort of like, well, why aren't all the policies here? And one of them was like, why not social care? As if this wasn't like this massive problem that probably needed some more sort of research and thinking, and that this is not maybe a policy you announce in like week one. I don't know what I feel about the two-child benefit cap thing, because obviously there are MPs tabling sort of rebel amendments. They're very angry. I'm not sure if they went ahead with the amendments. They're certainly talking about them, and they're very cross. Obviously, that hasn't been lifted. That's the main focus, I think, of left-wing criticism of Starmer at the moment. It seems like such an easy political win. But is that me thinking into political terms, and maybe that looking in the roundabout a child poverty strategy like is better? Like, do you think they should have put that policy in there?
I wasn't surprised that it wasn't in there. What they've said they're going to do is start a task force on child poverty that's going to look at a number of measures that could be taken, and I think it will change. But this was about sort of setting out the agenda of the government that's just been voted in on a manifesto, and I think it would be slightly strange to put something that resolutely was not in the manifesto in that speech. I'm also finding some of the criticism of it slightly disingenuous, like from the left of the Labour Party. I totally understand it. From the SNP, sort of understand it, although child poverty in Scotland is like also an issue. But from people like Suella Braverman and Miriam Cates, who are now going on about how it's the wrong kind of policy, and that is just despicable to me. That, I mean, okay, Miriam Cates isn't an MP anymore, Suella Braverman is, but you had the opportunity to speak out at the time. You didn't do it, and now you're hammering a government that's been in place for a week that is now dealing with the result of your policy. I think that is politics at its absolute worst.
One thing that isn't mentioned often is that actually just solely lifting the two-child benefit cap to please those rebel MPs and other critics isn't actually going to achieve its aim, because it's not going to lift that many families out of poverty. The reason being is that once you lift it, you very quickly come into the overall benefit cap. There aren't that many families that get to keep all of that money if it was lifted. So you've got to look at a whole welfare review around, and if you lift that cap, then you get into very complicated arguments around, is it okay for a family with lots of children to have more money than somebody working full-time? Because that would quite easily be an issue. So it does require a more considered review. Starmer is a pragmatist. There's no point taking that cap off and then not actually achieving its aim of lifting children out of poverty.
Fun fact on the mandate, which has come out of Luke Trill and More in Common, just keeps producing, which for me is very exciting. It's like kind of record store day.
He's my
data.
new like Twitter political crush. I'm obsessed.
No, and he just and one of them was the question about the mandate. There was always discussion because of the relatively low popular vote share and all of that. And they were going, do you think that Labour has a mandate to radically change the country? And everybody said yes, including Tories and Reform voters. So all this agonising over whether they have a mandate, and then you actually ask actual people as opposed to pundits, and they're like, yeah, they won the election.
Yeah.
Anyway.
End of.
Fun fact. I know. And I said that on Twitter, and people were shouting at me.
I also said that on Twitter, and people are still shouting at me.
People, man, what are you going to do? Now let's have a question from our Patreon backers in But Your Emails. If you support us on Patreon, you can send us a question and we will think about answering it. We've got one from Kate Hillam, who is playing favourites, I'm sorry to say. She says, one for Hannah.
Hi, Kate.
Rachel, you and I can just go for a coffee. We've got GB Energy and GB Trains. Is there scope for GB Housing, seeding local authorities and housing associations to build social housing at scale? Right to buy stays, but at a level where the money brought in covers costs and provides a small profit. Houses have a locality... Wow, I think she's into this.
She's as much of a geek as me.
Yeah, have a locality covenant, I don't even know what this is, which keeps future sale price lower for local people. GB Housing could also be an umbrella to train and employ the trades needed, and staff could be contracted out to help self-builders and small firms, perhaps breaking the stranglehold private house builders have over the sector. Is there anything in this? She says humbly, having obviously displayed enormous knowledge.
Thought about it really carefully.
Hard.
You may not know, you may know. I'm not sure if you're asking me this as a leading question. I advocated for years easily 15 years for a national development corporation to basically decide how many homes should be built and where, and to defeat some of the, the forces of NIMBYism, and also to control some of that budget in a central way so that it's being spent effectively. Is it actually going to happen, though, even in the brilliantly well thought out way that she says? No, it's not. There's no interest in this, unfortunately. Even the Labour government have absolutely no interest in it being a centralised process with overseers at the heart of government, which I think's the wrong thing. But this is where we are. We do know from the King's Speech, this government is incredibly committed to greater devolution. We're looking at more powers for city mayors. I am hoping those more powers might include borrowing abilities or lifting borrowing caps so that development can happen, again, led by councils in time as part of that handing over of responsibility. So that is why they're not going to do it centrally, because they really do want to devolve more responsibility to city mayors and other local forces. Can I say one thing about right to buy? Because I love hearing that someone else saying that they want right to buy to stay. This is my controversial view about right to buy. I used to hate it. I've done a complete 180. The reason is most of the wealth that's passed down in this country from generation to generation that entrenches lack of social mobility is through housing wealth. So middle-class families, older parents die, they pass on their housing wealth, or they gift large deposits or large chunks of money to help their children buy homes. That is what entrenches lack of social mobility. So in a similar way to some people advocate the universal basic income, I think it is the responsibility of the state to essentially level out some of that lack of opportunity by allowing people in social housing to take some of that wealth.
But isn't the problem that you don't get enough social housing?
Yep, the problem is that the receipts are not replacing them. The problem isn't right to buy. I actually think it's a really progressive policy in our current environment. It basically gives a state handout to people who don't have a parental handout. But you need to build loads of social housing to make the right social housing a more equal opportunity.
So you've just done a Thatcher, but from the left?
Yeah, basically. Mind blown.
Next up, there has been an alarming rise in the number of incidents of intimidation and abuse aimed at election candidates, according to John Woodcock, the government's advisor on political violence, who wrote to New Home Secretary Yvette Cooper on Monday. This has been widely described as the most aggressive election of modern times. You may have read about some of this. Justice Secretary Shabana Mahmood says she was branded an infidel and a community meeting was disrupted by masked men. Jess Phillips was heckled when she won re-election in Birmingham Yardley and reported that local activists were screamed at and had their tyres slashed. There is more. Why are candidates in danger and what can be done about it? This isn't new. Some candidates, especially women, stood down in 2019 due to safety fears. Back then, 60% of MPs said they'd contacted police about threats within the last year. Last year, 82% of local councillors surveyed said they had felt unsafe. And it's not just one political tendency. The examples that I was talking about was Labour MPs basically being sort of heckled and harassed over Gaza. But candidates for George Galloway's Workers' Party and Reform UK have been physically assaulted as well. I'm not sure by whom or why, but it seems to be happening all over the place. Hannah, what explains this? Is it just that everything is getting worse?
Just generally.
What's
I think
going on?
The barriers have come down. Our kind of that sort of respect and like distance we used to hold decision makers in has gone. You see it in every form actually of public service. You see it in people's relationship with their GPs and so on. That deference has disappeared. It has been encouraged, I think, by social media as well. We've altered the way we interact with people in positions of authority because they've become more accessible digitally as well as, out in the public sphere. I think that's obviously a good thing in many, many, many ways, but this is the dark side of that. It's the flip side. And added to that, we've obviously got the fact that politics in general has become more polarised than 20 years ago. The kind of the big, like the very left versus in the last 20 years, I think.
Has Britain become polarised though? Surely it's like the election shows that people are all over the shop.
I think what it is that the radically left-wing factions of parties and the radically right-wing factions of parties can get more attention now than they ever used to. I think, if you were an MP and you had a fringe position within your party, you didn't really get on the news. Journalists didn't really ask what you thought because you weren't really relevant. You were sort of in the party, but the way that you got a profile was by working your way up through a party, and the parties had a lot of control over who could and couldn't speak for them. And what social media has done is one MP makes a video saying something mad, and I'm not going to say what that thing might be, but suddenly they've got lots of attention.
They become main characters.
And then they become main characters, and then they're invited on news outlets, and then they say their view again, and then the ministers or shadow ministers have said, well, someone from your party has said XYZ, what do you think about it? And I think you are able to go from backbench nobody MP to superstar in 24 hours.
It's
now.
funny that if you just, reading political history and biographies and stuff, there were MPs back when we go, well, things were more civil then. There were people in the Labour Party who were basically Stalinists, and there were people in the Tory Party who had views which would make you throw up.
Who had views.
Views. They certainly had views. And just kind of remarkably extreme characters, but they were, obviously you get exceptions like Enoch Powell, but a lot of these people, we don't associate them with that period, whereas now if you've got an extreme view, like you said, everyone knows about it.
But they were moderated by that deference and that distance. But as you say, that's broken down, and now they're so visible as well.
Rachel, you speak to a lot of MPs as part of your job. How often do safety concerns come up?
All the time, pretty much. For female MPs, 100% of the time. For male MPs, I would say maybe 60%.
Wow.
And that's cross-party. It's one of the first things that, people will sort of, how are you finding being an MP, or what's your experience been, and they'll talk about that. So it really is, I think it happens a lot more than general public realise that it does, in part because the advice that a lot of MPs are given is not to talk about it too much in case it exacerbates it. So
it creates copycats.
It creates copycats. So all the MPs I know have a sort of a direct line to their local police service, and they forward stuff on. And it's just become something that is understood that is part of the job. And I think that's really sad. I was talking to, this is a couple of months ago now, to a Labour MP who is now in the government about the Gaza protests over the ceasefire vote and the motion, and she was somebody who was very sympathetic to Palestine, and one of the things that she wanted to do was to meet constituents and really understand their concerns about it. And on one of the days when there was a huge protest of Westminster, the kind where they basically tell you not to use the main exits, which is kind of a weird thing to hear anyway in a workplace, where you get told oh, by the way, use the underground exit because it's all getting a bit much out there. She had a number of constituents come to visit her in her office who had relatives in Palestine, who showed her photographs of their relatives and who were had lost their homes and were fleeing. And it was, she said, a really, really moving and powerful interaction that she had directly with her constituents that was so much more valuable to the cause and to sort of the act of representing her constituents than any of the stuff that was going on outside. And she said the problem is, if you encourage or allow that level of just, hurling abuse at your MP to continue, because I will be able to do fewer of those meetings.
Right. So it's not just because, obviously it's driving some people out of politics. The people have said that. That's why they're not standing again. It presumably is deterring some people who might have got into politics.
It absolutely is deterring people who might have got into politics.
And it's also obstructing the job that might help people.
It's encouraging existing politicians to put up walls because they have to think of their own personal safety.
A big part of our democracy in Britain is accessibility, that you've got the walk-in surgery and that, you can meet your MPs. It's satirised, but it matters. They do work for us. So if we're going to lose that as a result of safety concerns, that's a huge issue that's not fully thought through, I think.
And on the hustings point, Dorian, in your intro there, you said that Jess Phillips had been heckled at her account. I would say if you watch the video, I wouldn't necessarily call it heckling. She, was basically being shouted down abused while giving that speech. And I would advise anyone who hasn't seen that video to go watch it, because it is heartbreaking and enraging. A woman who has been elected democratically having to shout and full of a sort of anger and a certain amount of fear, although Jess Phillips is able to sort of turn fear into something positive, but talking about what she faced on the campaign trail. If there were hustings and that was the response of people in the audience, that's not good for democracy either.
And this is someone who very publicly resigned her shadow.
This is the strangest
resigned
thing.
her post because she wanted to rebel on the ceasefire vote.
This is the strangest thing. Her and Rupert Huck as well, both MPs who stood against their own leadership on the issue that is being protested on in those examples, were still the targets.
Now, the politics is obviously tricky because, like I said, there's many, many, many kinds of harassment. I think Stella Creasy was being followed down the street by somebody who was like an anti-abortion activist. Covers a lot of things. John Woodcock brings up the fact, focused on these sort of independent candidates who essentially ran on Gaza. That was their main, at least, message. And then Diane Abbott, who has probably experienced more abuse than perhaps any MP in the Commons. I mean, certainly because she's been in it longer than any other woman, called that a crude effort to demonize all those who support Palestinian rights. Rachel, how do you unpack that? I was a bit taken aback by her remark.
I don't think it is unfair to say that Diane Abbott, though she has been a trailblazer, though she has been an incredible force for progressive values on the left, I think it's fair to say that she has a bit of a blind spot when it comes to people facing harassment and discrimination that doesn't fit her particular experience or her particular image of that. And I think you can see that in the letter she wrote to The Guardian that got her suspended from the Labour Party a year or so ago, when she essentially said that various other groups didn't face racism in particular ways. And I think you can see that here in an inability to empathise with people who have different views to her, but are facing the same kind of abuse and harassment that she has faced. And I'm actually quite disappointed in her, because I think she had an incredible opportunity with this to say, I am somebody who has suffered this in extreme circumstances for decades of my parliamentary career. It's not acceptable when it happens to me, and it's not acceptable when it happens to anyone else. And she wasn't able to do that, and I'm quite disappointed.
I just felt that the left in general were a bit weird about a lot of that stuff, because I mean they'll be the first to denounce far right aggression, as they should, and be very courageous in standing up to far right aggression. But it seemed like there was something that just sort of scrambled brains about the people who are being really aggressive towards these women, including several Muslim women, they were angry about Gaza. And so it's kind of like, well, is it just, are emotions just running high here? And it was like, you've got to be against harassment, and intimidation, full stop. If they're behaving in a certain way, that's the test, not the belief, the behaviour.
I mean, Woodcock described it as a strategy when he was talking about this, which I thought was a strange word. There is, it's true, evidence of some coordination, but the word strategy, I was worried, kind of slightly downplays it a bit. Oh, it's just part of the election process. It's a bit of politicking. That's not what happened. I
think it made it worse, because surely if it's a strategy that it's a deliberately anti-democratic strategy, that's worse, right?
For me, I read it more, it kind of hit my ear in a sort of, he's making it sound like it's about this one issue, that it's a strategy that for those people who are campaigning around Gaza, when actually it's a symptom of a much bigger issue we've been discussing, and to attach it to the most recent example of it, the most visible example in the current environment, downplays the broader significance.
I think his focus on a particular kind was not helpful if you're trying to make that broader point. Rachel, it goes without saying that you don't need to sort of go, we're becoming like America in political violence, because, Joe Cox and David Amos were murdered. I think there's somebody that I'm not sure if you spoke to him. I read about him in one of your articles, Mike Freer, the Tory MP for Finchley and Golders Green. Not only did he step down after an arson attack, but he'd previously been visited by the guy who went on to kill David Amos.
Yeah, Mike Freer is a really, really lovely former Conservative MP. He's one of those former MPs who no one in the Commons ever had a bad word to say about, and a really, really good constituency MP is my parents' constituency of Finchley and Golders Green. And that was devastating when his office had an arson attack, and he announced that he was stepping down kind of because of that, and that the guy who had killed David Amos had turned up at his office as well and then gone to kill someone else, and he's got a real sort of horrendous sliding doors moment. What I think is interesting about that constituency is what happened next is in the election, Sarah Sackman ran for the Labour Party, and she's the MP now, very prominent in the Jewish community. Did an interview with me in the New Statesman that I've talked about on this podcast. A guy called Alex Dean ran for the Conservatives, who's also quite prominent in the Conservative Party. And both of them multiple times did events together and sort of said that they wanted it to be a really respectful, robust debate, but that they respected each other and that they weren't going to let what had happened to Mike Freer and the circumstances of his departure get in the way of what they were trying to achieve there. And I found that really moving, actually.
Is there a clear line for you between the acceptable and unacceptable forms of protest? Like, what is part of the job and what is on the escalator of intimidation? And we know that that escalator can lead to horrendous stuff.
I think you've always got to flip that around and say, what are you trying to achieve? If you are a constituent who is trying to get your local MP to change their mind, is screaming at them in the street, is following them home, is following their children home, going to help you towards that goal? Or would it be more constructive to make an appointment with them and sit down and go to the House of Commons or go to their constituency office and talk to them, as the relationship is meant to work out? And if you are choosing to do the loud, shouty protest thing, that kind of already says that you're not interested in changing their mind. You're not interested in engaging in democracy. You are only interested in threatening and intimidating them and in possibly raising your own profile. So I think that's my answer.
Do you know what? Researching this subject made me weirdly sympathetic to Andrew Jenkins, which I hated that feeling. But when she gave protesters the middle finger 2 years ago, and I'm sure we said on this podcast, it's absolute contempt for the people, and because she's not a person I'm very fond of, and then because she was talking about harassment again this week, and I went back to the news reports of that incident, and she said it was in the context of having had loads of harassment and death threats from some of the people she gave the finger to. And I was like, oh, okay. I dismissed that as how fucking dare you treat the voters like that.
It makes sense now.
And then I was like, oh, maybe. I basically, because I am a flawed man, I would definitely have done that. I would probably also have said things. Once again, running theme of this show is why I'm not an MP, but I did identify with that feeling.
That's also an interesting point, which is that if you are an MP and you get shouted at and screamed at on your way to work or whatever, and you one time scream back, that's a news story.
Yeah.
Yes, I do. I have to say, I don't forgive her for that, even though I understand on as you say, that human level, the temptation to just flip the bird would be very high. Because actually we pay our MPs to represent us and behave in a way that's fitting, and it is an example-setting thing. And, just as important a part of our democracy as an MP's safety and respect is.
What can be done about it? They've got these hotlines to the police. They've got police protection in Birmingham, where a lot of this was happening. There were police officers at polling stations. So the police are kind of on it. What else can be done?
The only thing that they can do, unless short of actually, really restricting access, which I wouldn't like to see, the only thing they can do is what I think actually we talked about a little bit before, is just take down the tone of every debate. Just bring it all down, which we've talked about, turning exciting things into boring sounding policy. And actually that does work to kind of moderate debate a little bit.
That's Labour's vibe shift, isn't it? They're trying
who knows where that's going to take us in 5 years. Let's hope it will pull the temperature down a little bit.
I think maybe just getting people to actually do things that they think are useful. Like you said, be persuasive, ask questions, meet with your MP, use the democratic means, because none of that stuff helps. None of that changes a single mind.
And get off TikTok.
Well, I'm safe.
I'm not on TikTok.
I'm not on TikTok. That is the show. Follow us on TikTok. Thanks to Hannah.
Thank you.
And Rachel.
Thank you.
Stick around for the extra bit after Demonism Wants to Buy Corner Shop and a fanfare for our generous supporters who keep the show on the road. You can join them for as little as £3 a month and get the podcast early, without advertisements, and lots more tasty bonuses. Search Oh God What Now Patreon to find out how. We'll see you next time.
Hello, and many thanks for covering some of our enormous gas and electricity bills too. Ruth Britton, Rob Balla, Paul Donnelly, Hanny Hannah, Susanna Brown and Phil Brotherton.
Huge thanks from me for your contribution to our water bill and business rates to Anna Denny, Morris, Mike Rogerson, Scotty Jones, Nicola Dempsey and Karina.
And thanks from me to new backers Gavin McLean, #Timmy and Matthew Hawes. Welcome back to 2 returning backers, Daya Mishra and Ben Price. And renewing for the second time, he can't stay away. It's Chris Wimlett.